Hey, thank you all so much for being here for EmberConf 2019. Yehuda and I are both really excited and really grateful that you all made the trip out to Portland, so thank you for being here. We've got a great show for you today. So the first thing I want to talk about is just to mention that EmberConf operates under a code of conduct. So we ask that while you're here, be mindful of your behavior. We don't tolerate any kind of harassment. We want this to be a welcoming environment for everyone. If you see something happening, please feel empowered to say something. If you have any problems or if you experience anything happening that's not creating a welcoming environment, please talk to any of the staff members. Come talk to me or Yehuda. Staff members are wearing green t-shirts. You can also reply to any of the emails you've received from the conference. But I think I want to go one step beyond that, which is, of course, don't harass people. But let's actively create a welcoming community. It can be really intimidating being at a conference for the first time, especially if you don't know anyone. So if you're standing in a circle and talking, and someone comes up and they're out on the outside, just kind of like take a step back, let them in. Let's go above and beyond and live up to our values of a welcoming and inclusive community. So thank you for that.
And I would also add, just in general, you don't need to second guess if somebody okay, that's very loud. Okay. In general, you don't need to second guess if somebody looks uncomfortable, acts uncomfortable, someone tells you that someone is being uncomfortable. Like, the reaction that you should have if somebody says that is just stop doing what you're doing.
So we've got a lot to cover today, so let's just jump right into it. Ember is going to be 8 years old this year, which is a really long time. Thank you. Some of you have been here for the whole time, so thank you very much for that. So in that time, 8 years, the web has really changed dramatically. And given that rapid change, it's really unusual to find a JavaScript framework or a library that has so consistently evolved along with the platform. And I think that the most important part of navigating those changes is making sure that we're staying true to our values, not simply chasing trends. So we've always known that Ember is a framework for building ambitious web applications, right? That's been on the homepage since the very beginning. We're not building little widgets. We're not doing something that is anything else other than building an application, right? We were very clear in our sense of purpose. But on top of that goal of building web applications, we've also always had this really foundational value in Ember, which is this idea, a phrase that we borrowed from DHH from Rails, that we climb the mountain together. So building ambitious web applications is the mountain, and we want to climb that mountain together. So that means shared tools that work when you're starting out, and they scale up to, they scale with you, your skills, and your application as it evolves. It means shipping features. We believe that shipping features is more important than tinkering with config files. And when we do need to make big changes, we move as a community. Because nothing stops you shipping features faster than having to stop and rewrite your application.
So how do we make sure that the work that we do is actually aligned with our values? So when we were thinking about this talk, we borrowed an idea from Simon Sinek, who talks about something called the celery test. He studies decision-making in organizations. And the idea of the celery test is when you go to the grocery store, you have infinite options in what you can buy. And so you might have some person that tells you, you should buy M&Ms. You should buy M&Ms. That worked for my company, and if you don't use M&Ms, you're an idiot. Right? And another person might tell you, like, you should buy celery. That's great for you. Another person might tell you, you should buy rice milk. And then maybe right when you're about to decide what you're going to do, someone comes over to you and says, actually, I know what the answer is. The answer is Oreos, or the answer is the paleo diet, or whatever. So now you go to the grocery store, and you spend all this time, all this money acquiring these items, but you haven't really thought about whether they're right for you or what you're trying to accomplish. And you just did it because someone else thought it was a good idea. And worse, if somebody's trying to understand like who you are, what you're about, and they see you with all the the combination of everything that anybody ever thought was a good idea, they don't really have any idea what is going on, what you're about, what kind of person you are. Now imagine if the same thing happened, but before going to the store, we think about what we're going to do, what kind of person we want to be. And we decide we're only going to buy healthy foods. So once we thought about that, even though we know that people told us, like, you're being silly if you don't buy M&Ms, that's like the new hot fad, we know that we're not going to do that. We know we're going to go to the grocery store and we're going to buy the celery and the rice milk. And not only does that save us time and money, it also doesn't leave any confusion about what it is that we believe. Someone can look at our shopping cart and they immediately see, this is someone who believes in eating healthy food. And if that person also believes in eating healthy food, they're not going to ask the person with the M&Ms and Oreos in their cart what to get. They're going to ask the person with the celery and the rice milk. So putting all this another way, more than anything we say out loud or think about ourselves, what decisions that we make communicate to the world what we believe. And while it is good for us to learn from what other people are doing, especially if they have similar values, before we take their advice, we should make sure it makes sense in the context of our beliefs and our values. We should make decisions on the basis of our values. We shouldn't let our values be derived from the random collection of decisions that we made. So if you look at the things that we prioritized, you can actually see that the core idea of the things that we prioritize is grounded in the foundational value of climbing the mountain together. For example, we prioritized code mods. We prioritized the 6-week release cycle. And those things are designed to make it easy and predictable for everyone in this room and everyone in the wider Ember community to upgrade together, right? We upgrade together on a regular cadence because we're all doing the same thing together. I was actually, a long time ago when we started doing the surveys, I'm no longer very surprised by this, but I was surprised at how much it's true that the surveys show that people are usually on the latest version of Ember or the second to most recent version of Ember. And that's like something that we prioritized as a group. So having everyone use the same tool, Ember CLI, that was a thing that we chose to do very early on, and building an ecosystem of shared add-ons, all these things allow us to build a group of people that are trying to do the same thing together. But just as important as the things that we chose to do are the things that we chose to leave on the cutting room floor. So for example, when we first started Ember, we were able to use Ember with a simple script tag. And we cut that because it didn't allow us to move together as a community and do the same thing. It didn't allow us to share the work of building big applications. And it's not that anything on this slide is a bad idea. There are other frameworks that do some of these things and are perfectly successful in the context of their values. But they weren't a priority for us given our values. These were actually things that people told us with a lot of vigor were very important. But if you apply the celery test, if you look at like what it looks like to apply the value of climbing the mountain together, where the mountain is building ambitious web applications, it just was clear that these things weren't important for Ember. So some cases, like should Ember 2.0 be a complete reboot of the framework? That's an easy call. But sometimes it's a less clear-cut call, and our values seem to be pulling us in two different directions at once. So you apply the celery test, and the answer comes up with two opposite things. One example of that problem is the tension between stability and progress. So if we're too aggressive, if we try too hard to make progress at all costs, the move fast and break things thing, then we leave people behind. We're going up the mountain, and like people are getting stuck behind. But if we don't adopt new ideas, if we focus all of our energy on making sure that that everything is as maximally stable as we can imagine, then people stop using Ember. People decide to race up the mountain on their own or go off and find a different mountain. So in general, what we've had to do over the 8-year lifetime of Ember, is striking a balance between fragmentation, what happens when we race ahead and try a lot of things without really figuring out exactly what it is that we're doing, but making good progress while we do that, and cautious changes, which allow us to consolidate and get everyone on the same page at the cost of slowing down and maybe not being as caught up with the wider ecosystem as we want. So we have to sort of balance these two things. But even though it seems easy, like it seems like, oh, that's obvious. Obviously, that's a balance, and obviously you strike a balance and you find the answer. It's actually pretty hard to do that well. So like I said, aggressive changes make it hard for the community to move together. But if we're too cautious, then Ember can seem to fall behind. And on top of that, finding the right balance for Ember is different than finding the right balance for Rails or finding the right balance for Perl, right? It depends a lot on what the context that we're inside of, the wider JavaScript ecosystem. So on top of having to find the right balance between aggressive and cautious changes in general, we have to avoid diverging too much from the overall JavaScript ecosystem. And that's something that like you can quibble about how effective we have been at that, but we've spent a lot of energy on making sure that like we're using modules, we're using classes, we're using promises, right? All these things are things we spend a lot of time on, And that's like another dimension in how you have to think about striking this balance, right? It's not just about what we're all doing together, it's what we're also doing as a wider ecosystem.
So as an example of this, in the Ember 1.13 era, if you were around for that, we felt that this reliance that we had on the two-way data binding programming model was causing us to fall behind in the wider ecosystem. So we deprecated many APIs all at once to push people towards this idea of data down, actions up. And that absolutely helped us move quickly to the new programming model. But that sudden influx of deprecations required a lot of frustrating refactoring, and it left many apps, more than we would have liked, unable to make the jump from 1.13 to Ember 2.0, which kind of pushed us into this danger zone. So this was a time where we were making a lot of really big foundational changes, probably the biggest foundational changes we had made since the project started. But at the same time, we were coupling those with these really aggressive deprecations that just caused a lot of churn in the ecosystem.
So once we experienced that, everyone working on Ember is building apps, and it wasn't lost on anyone. So we noticed this fragmentation issue. So the center wasn't holding, everything was fragmenting. So we took our foot off the pedal during the Ember 2.0 series, and that allowed the ecosystem some time to catch up. It allowed ourselves some time to stabilize the code base, and there were a lot of releases that looked like that said, there's not a lot of features here, we're working on stabilizing the code base. And if you look at those releases, it's not that there weren't a lot of commits during those releases, it's that there was nothing very notable to tell anyone about. It was really about stabilizing our code base and the ecosystem. But that also came with its own cost, and notably, it made the perception of Ember falling behind the competition. So we did a lot of work during this era. Like we did Glimmer 2, we eliminated backflow re-render, if you know what that means, which basically is finishing data down, actions up. We stabilized the container in the registry. We actually shipped engines during this time period. But like none of these features are banner features. They're not features that I think we even talked about in the keynote, right? They were just quiet features that stabilized things, which got us away from the danger zone of fragmentation, but moved us more towards the danger zone of falling behind. So to recap, like in Ember 1.x, we shipped a lot of little things quickly. It caused fragmentation and incoherence in the ecosystem. We moved fast and broke things. In the 2x era, we focused a lot more on stability and coherence of the whole picture of Ember, but we didn't ship that many user-visible things. And Ember 3.0, the era that we're in now, is about finding a balance between shipping things incrementally while also keeping an eye towards the coherence of the whole system. So we're not just shipping anything we think of and causing a lot of fragmentation, but we're also not stopping the world and trying to make everything perfect before we ship it, right? We're trying to ship things with an eye towards coherence. So far I've talked about what it means that Ember became incoherent during the 1.x series, and it became more coherent in the 2.x series. But what do I mean when I say coherent? What does that mean concretely? What does it mean for you as a user? And the reason why coherence is on a slide here, the reason why I'm talking about it as a term is that if you read RFCs or listen to our design conversations, especially in the 3x era, this is a concept that we talk about a lot to think about how to do feature design in Ember and how features and APIs interact with each other. And so really what the Ember 3.x era is about making commitments to stability without designing the entire future. So here's one example of that. It really sucks as an Ember user that you have to write .get everywhere. That was a very annoying aspect of Ember. I didn't like it as a user. And last year, like in January, we figured out a good solution for getting rid of .get. And I think in the 2x era, we would have said, we're not going to do that because we can't get rid of .set right now, and that's an asymmetrical picture. And but in the 3x era, what we have basically said is, as long as we kind of know where we're going with this, the value that you get as a user for being able to write this.firstname is so great that it's worth actually shipping that feature and like as soon as we're willing to commit to the stability, as long as we know what the long-term story is.
So another example of this kind of incoherence, I think giving you a concrete example when you hear this term incoherence, is the shift that we made from this curly invocation syntax for components to this angle bracket syntax. How many people here have tried using the angle bracket syntax in your apps? Oh, wow, fantastic, all right, awesome. So hopefully you love it as much as we do. And I think it works really great. And you got used to calling your own components with this new syntax. But there was a slight problem, which is if you now try to use that exact same syntax that you're used to for calling your own components, and you try to use it to call a built-in component that comes from the framework, like the input component, you actually get an error. And I think in the previous time, we would have said, like, oh, this is too big of a problem. We can't ship angle bracket components until we figure out how to address this. But now we're more comfortable with this incoherence or this inconsistency. Because it means that you see how many people have been using it. And that feedback loop has been incredibly important for thinking about how we evolve the framework. But let's imagine you're a tech lead. Maybe you're the lead engineer on a team, and you've got 5 other engineers, and they're looking to you for guidance on when to adopt features like this. So you've got to make a decision when you're kind of in this spot, which is, do I teach the folks on my team about these rules and these edge cases, and do I have to teach them this? You have to teach both at the same time, right? You have to have both at the same time in your head. Or should I wait until all of these edge cases and these rough edges have been smoothed down before we adopt it as a team and we adopt it in our code base? But now we have this question of, well, if you're the tech lead, how do you know when that time is? Unless you're paying attention to every RFC and every commit and every pull request, how would you know when the right time to adopt is if you want a very smooth experience?
And maybe there is no time, even if we keep doing it over and over again.
So this incremental change, getting back to this incremental style of change is really great for us. It lets us ship features. It's really great for Ember users because they get this value right away. The problem is that when you're halfway between these two worlds, the new world and the old world, it's kind of embarrassing. So let's call this midway point the pit of incoherence that we fall into. And really, this kind of incoherence is frankly, it's embarrassing when you're a framework that the whole value proposition is it's a coherent whole. So this style of working, it also has a side effect of creating churn, right? People upgrade Ember, and they get a deprecation warning, or they see some new feature, and they feel like they have to refactor all their code to use it. But a lot of times, without the bigger context of where we want to be, it's not even really clear what value it's bringing to the application.
So in the 2x era, we saw that this embarrassment was embarrassing. So we got into a mode where we tried to design as much of the new world as we could up front so that we could sort of do a hop from where we are to where we want to be, a quick hop. Unfortunately, that's not how the real world works. The real world works like this. Where we want to be is always a little further off. And so the best laid plans of mice and men result in spaghetti. So this is basically the story of things like routable components or the original angle bracket components or module unification. These are all things where we tried to design the future so that we would have a nice quick hop, and then by the time we actually got to the end of the design, the future was still far off in the distance. And frankly, we moved back to the incremental style in the 3x era because we had no choice. The 2x era didn't have enough of us shipping things that were of the most value to users. And hopefully what you've noticed since in the last year or so is that we've been shipping relentlessly. And like just speaking as an Ember user, I've been very happy that I got to write this dot first name instead of this dot get first name the entire year, instead of having to wait for us to finalize some kind of perfect plan. But at the same time, like the more of those features that we've shipped a little at a time, the more it has become clear to us that we need a way to tell everyone that like the whole set of features that we're working on is ready to use. They're ready for everybody. They're both coherent in terms of the technical details, but also Ember's documentation incorporated the changes. It's like ready for you to use yourself as a new user or as a team.
So we want to try to kind of bend the curve of trade-offs here, which I'm sure is a term you've heard before. And as we know from quantum mechanics, even though light travels as a wave, sometimes it's useful to model it as discrete quantums of photons. Yehuda was begging me not to use
the clock says we have 10 minutes.
Yehuda was begging me not to use the quantum mechanics analogy. So we're trying this new thing called additions. And the idea here is that we take a snapshot of the framework. We have a way of signaling to you, to all of the core teams, to our entire community, and perhaps most importantly, to the wider JavaScript ecosystem at these points of maximum coherence, where we say all of these features that are all related and they all reinforce and complement each other, they've all landed, they're all polished, we can go document them. It's a good time for you to adopt all of these things in your application right now. So that's what we're doing with Octane. Ember Octane is a snapshot, a peak of coherence where we've landed all this great stuff, and we think now is a time for people to start playing with it, trying it out, and getting ready to adopt it. So Octane is a new edition of Ember that gives us that time for documentation and polish and explaining to everyone how these things work together.
So over the past year, some of our most adventurous users have helped us to test out a bunch of new features. I'm one of them. Octane is the signal that we're giving to the wider community that the features have come together into a cohesive whole, that it makes sense if you're plugging away in a project and you are trying to figure out, like, when should I schedule some time to use angle bracket components? Like, when we ship Octane. So we're shipping a preview now. I'm jumping ahead, but we're shipping a preview now. We're not shipping the final Octane just yet. But when we ship the final Octane, that's a time for you and your team to actually say, now's a good time for us to allocate a sprint to actually try to use angle bracket components or any of the other features because the documentation is ready, because I'm not going to hit those weird input things. So in general, the theme of Octane, the features of Octane are about improving how you write components. And so that's what we're going to be focusing on in the next few minutes as we talk through what Octane is. So the first thing, the first major part of Octane is that when we started using Ember, when we started building Ember, I used to give a talk where I said jQuery is the standard library of the web, and that's why we're using jQuery. Now the web is more or less its own standard library. Like, a lot of time has gone by, and incorporating jQuery as a mandatory part of the stack, or something that you have to take an active step to remove, was just a legacy of 8 years ago in the Dr. Tomster book. So we got to the point where we can tell everyone you can really use Ember without jQuery, and like things like Ember data doesn't use jQuery.ajax turned out to be some effort. Like, you could have technically done it, but not without really knowing what you're doing. And now we're basically saying you can use Ember without jQuery for real. It really works, and there's not a lot of caveats. And like, one thing that's interesting about jQuery is that if you look at Ember, like, it's a surprisingly large part of Ember's payload. So Ember is 128K, jQuery is 28K, right? So getting rid of jQuery actually removes a fifth of Ember's size, which I didn't guess when we first started working on it.
So the next thing is JavaScript classes. When we started, the version of JavaScript that we had to target was ES3, because that's what was in Internet Explorer. ES5 was the hot new thing. But in that time, JavaScript classes have been standardized into the language, and now we can take advantage of them. So the benefit here, I think, is that it's a standard that everyone either knows or will know when they learn JavaScript. So that gives you knowledge portability. If you learn classes in Ember, you'll be able to take that with you to a different job that uses a different technology stack. And we also get really great integration with things like IDEs, linters, basically the whole ecosystem. There's a common idea and a common concept and syntax for classes. And also, that also means that translates into working great with other tools like TypeScript that layer on top of the JavaScript language. So to just get a sense for what this looks like, I grabbed the service off of the Ember Observer source code that uses the classic object model. And you can see it's not bad. It's like pretty good when that's all you have and you have to do everything.
For 8 years ago.
For 8 years ago, it's, yeah, not bad. And this is what the equivalent thing looks like if we port it to the native JavaScript syntax using decorators. So you can see that the semantics are identical here, right? We're not losing anything. We're not losing any expressiveness. In fact, we're gaining because we just have a nicer, more concise, built into the language way of describing what we were having to do in user land before. So
and that means that all the other tooling knows what we're doing.
So for example, now when we want to make a subclass, we just say class extends Ajax service. And if we want to inject a service, the session service, we just use the @service decorator rather than having to set this kind of like custom property. And if you're coming into Ember, you read that, you're not really sure what's going on there. We also get to use some new proposals like class fields. And we also have this nice syntax for computed properties that is just a little bit more terse, right? It's a little bit less typing that you have to do. And when you're scanning and reading, it's just that much more clear. And then as Yehuda mentioned, I think this is probably the thing that we wanted most when we got started. The thing we really wanted to get rid of was this.get and this.set. Now you can just use normal JavaScript property notation, and everything just works like you'd expect when you're learning the framework. And one thing I want to call out here that I think is pretty cool, and is not an accident. We worked really hard to make this happen. The idea here is that this is a syntactic change. And that means that you don't have to really think about the behavior changing, just the actual symbols and words on the editor. So all the imports stay the same. You don't have to refactor your imports. Everything there stays the same. And we've designed them in a way that they work in both of these contexts incrementally, so you can do that kind of incremental migration. You don't have to do a big bang rewrite of your whole code base. Another big improvement that we landed that we already talked about is angle bracket invocation. This idea that instead of using the curly braces to invoke a component, you can use this nice angle bracket syntax that looks more similar to HTML, but you can still disambiguate it because of the capital letter that it starts with. And I think this seems like maybe a small change, because it really is just about syntax, right? It doesn't change behavior at all. But the goal here, I think, is really scannability. Ergonomics, readability, these things are very important to us. And I've noticed in the templates that I work on, when we switch them from the curly braces to the angle brackets, there's no more ambiguity about whether that's a value coming from a component or whether it's a helper. Components, which have become such an important part of the Ember programming model, they really stand out visually and just brings that level of clarity to your templates. I think that's really great. But there's another important thing, too, which is that we do have an important benefit other than just the clarity and the readability over the curly brace syntax, which is that we now have syntax for disambiguating between JavaScript properties, arguments that we pass to these components, and HTML attributes. And sometimes the difference between properties and attributes in the DOM seems like kind of an academic, kind of trivial thing. In fact, I didn't know the difference for a long time. But this is really important to be good citizens of the web platform, and especially to unlock things like accessibility. Because so many of the web standards that rely on being able to set attributes, like the ARIA specification for better accessibility in the web browsers, they rely on this ability to set arbitrary attributes. And now you don't have to rely on the component that you're calling thinking about accessibility. You can just set the attribute when you call, and things will just work.
And you don't no longer have to have a huge list of attribute bindings that enumerates every possible attribute you could have thought of and accept pull requests forever to add stuff. Anybody can add attributes. Yes.
So that's angle bracket invocation, easier to scan visually. Also some nice parlor tricks like one-word components and HTML attributes.
So that's the invocation side. And one thing that actually turned out to be pretty cool about the angle bracket invocation side is that it works just the same with any kind of component, including components that extend from Ember object or components that extend from the new Glimmer base class. So angle brackets, you can just use them. It's just a syntactic transformation. It gives you the extra features of being able to use class equals or ARIA role equals. But on top of that, there's a need to modernize the actual base class itself, because the base class has still very involved in things like two-way bindings. There's the annoyance of how you express how the tag name works and things like that. So Glimmer components are a new base class for Ember that is smaller, that gives you, that eliminates the need to use a DSL in JavaScript to specify how the tag works, and also gives you one-way bindings, explicit immutable arguments. And that's something that I think everybody knows is the right practice, but it's something that the framework was allowing you to be sloppy about, and I made a lot of mistakes when I forgot to do the right thing. So here's an example of something that sucks. So when we started Ember, the way that people thought about components is a component is a thing that represents an element of the DOM and has some stuff inside of it. And so OK, in that case, we need to have some API for specifying what the element of the DOM is. And that has all this colon stuff and having to learn things like class name bindings. And that is annoying because we already know how to put attributes in the DOM. We already know how to put dynamic things. If it didn't happen to be the root element, it would be a lot easier to write. So in a Glimmer component, we can eliminate the component class entirely. This component class, which looks like it's doing a lot of things and is a lot of the time all your component class is doing, we can eliminate it entirely. just because Glimmer components, the HTML that you see in your template is the whole HTML. There's no extra element wrapping it that you have to do a bunch of shenanigans to explain, right? There's just the thing that's in your template is the actual thing that will be in the DOM, and so you already know how to set classes, you already know how to set attributes. You just use the same API that you used before. Okay, so that's, sorry, I'll linger on that, or try anyway. So that's kind of a big deal for me, is that we basically got this situation where maybe one of the hardest things to learn about Ember is this very involved attribute syntax, and it's like the kind of the definition of accidental complexity. It's like all stuff we already know how to do in our template. Like if you wrote tag name empty string, it mostly worked. You just had to know that hack. Yes, I'm hearing some laughter from the peanut gallery. Now, the final like big piece of Octane's programming model. So a few slides ago, like Tom showed you a slide where it had like @computed and had the same annoying computer property syntax as before, and like that bought us a lot. But I think in the time frame since then, we actually figured out how to allow you to write code and figure out what the dependencies are just from usage. So what track properties are a state-of-the-art change tracking system. If you think about it, when you write a template, you don't have to put your dependencies anywhere. They just are derived from actual usage. So we basically took that same system and made it work everywhere in JavaScript. You get the same fast and efficient updates that you got before. Like the performance is basically the same as before. And importantly, we talked about the fact that we got rid of this.get before. Finally, with track properties, you can also get rid of this.set. Woo! Yeah. End of the story. It's coherent again. Yes. So track properties, the way it works is anytime you have a property in your class where the change could affect the DOM, you mark it as tracked, and that's it. So here's like a very simple counter component where you're like clicking on a button and incrementing, like everyone made that tutorial. And the way it works is you say the count property is tracked, and then the increment action is doing this.count++, like you're allowed to say ++ there. You didn't have to think about anything other than marking it as tracked. And if you remove the tracked annotation, it won't work anymore, but it will work as a regular JavaScript class. Like if you open the console and started playing around with it, it doesn't do anything special other than say like this piece of state when it changes might update the DOM. Now, like one of the best things about the system, like one of my favorite things about it, is that you don't actually need to do anything special to use getters or functions or any other kind of extraction. If you want to pull out a getter, you want to pull out a function, you want to start calling a library which does some string manipulation. The only thing you have to do to make any of that work is mark the underlying state that could change as tracked, and every other kind of JavaScript works just as is, right? So this getter works just as is.
So one of the coolest things to me about track properties, I think there's been a lot of exploration and experimentation in the wider ecosystem about how to do efficient change tracking, how to do efficient updates of UIs, and we've certainly benefited from a lot of that experimentation and incorporated those ideas into track properties. But I think to me, like one of the things that is so exciting about track properties is that it's part of a much larger system. It's not just the component layer. What's really powerful about track properties is that they work in any class, not just components. So it's super easy to write classes that encapsulate some kind of domain model. So for example, here we have this person class, and it has a first name and a last name and a birth year. And because these are the properties, the underlying state or data that might change, we've annotated all of those as tracked. But from then on, anything that computes that derives some data from that underlying state, or anything that makes mutations to that state, doesn't have to think about it. There's no boilerplate. There's nothing extra you have to type. You just opt it into the track system at the lowest level, and then everything else just reacts from there.
You're being very, very explicit about what state can change, but you don't have to do anything more than that.
So here we have this what's effectively a computed property, a JavaScript getter, that calculates the age by taking the difference between today's year and their birth year. And then we have this method that does a mutation, which just randomizes their age by setting their birth year to a random year between 1900 and 2000. So what's really cool about this is that we can do something like this. We can take a new model instance. We can create it in a different component. We can create it in our router, like in the model hook. we can take that model and we can pass it into another component. So imagine we have this user editor component, and we're going to pass an instance of this model, this person class, into the component as an argument. And then we have some action in the component that calls this randomize age method, right? And what's, I think, so cool about this is that we're able to take, I mean, this is kind of a stupid example, but you could imagine, you have like a quite complex domain model. I'm sure everyone here has worked with something like this. You really want to be able to encapsulate it. You don't want to have to push all of this knowledge about your domain models into your components, which is a lot of times what you have to do when that is the core primitive of change tracking in the tool that you're using. So now we can take that thing, pass it in, and as the, why did my video not play? Okay. Oh, there it goes. Okay, cool. Oh boy. There we go. Okay, so the thing that's cool about this is you got this randomize age button, you click it, and you have this like very reactive system, right? So you have all that mutation, all the logic for the mutation. You have the annotation about what is the underlying state in this model. The component doesn't need to know about that. All it needs to know about is that it can use those properties in its template, and it can call these methods that may or may not make mutations. And the reason this is important, like, again, this is kind of a stupid demo, but imagine that it's just very common that you have multiple components on the screen that are talking about the same piece of data, right? You might have the user, and you have a nav bar where they can click to edit their account, and then they might be editing their profile. And I think all of us have experienced that category of bugs. We've had the right code to deal with the fact that we're making a change over here, and we need to reflect it over here, but these components shouldn't know about each other. And what usually ends up happening is you have to you inherently have this coupling of these component hierarchies that you don't want to be coupled, but because they have this kind of shared root of domain, of knowledge about this domain thing, you just have to have that coupling when you don't want it. So data down and actions up is great, but it's not everything. Sometimes you have data that's just shared across multiple components, and you don't want to write this highly coupled application where everything must know about everything else. And perhaps what I love the most about track properties, the thing that we've been striving for so long, is that it's almost this like Platonic ideal of simplicity. It's so easy to teach track properties because there's one rule that you have to remember. And that is, if you mutate a property and you expect that change or that mutation should be reflected into the DOM, you expect the DOM to update based on that, just make sure it's marked as tracked.
Basically, mutation is no longer a dangerous thing that you have to think a lot about. As long as the thing that you're mutating is marked as tracked, the rest of the system takes care of it. It occurs to me that there's a thing we don't have a slide for, but is really, really important, which is that the tracked decorator works in your ES5 classes, right? So if you have an ember.object.extend and you want to go from using a computed property to tracked, you say, like first name colon tracked parentheses, and that works just fine. And basically tracked and the old get and set model works seamlessly together. So this is like a really incremental system. You can take your existing app, you can migrate, if you want to Glimmer classes, you can migrate just your existing classes to start using a little bit of tracked state. You can remove some of your computed property dependencies if you're using tracked state. That's the benefit. But you don't have to like rewrite everything to take advantage of it. The underlying primitives are seamlessly work together. We should have a slide for that.
Yeah, well, maybe next year.
So these are some of the features that we're the most excited about, sort of the feature list. But I think it's easy to miss what's important about Octane by looking at the feature list. It might be hard to tell from looking at the pieces. But when you put them all together, it really makes a difference and makes the whole thing feel a lot more productive.
Mm-hmm. I mean, here's the thing. When I go to work and I'm doing UI development, I'm building a web application, I don't want to have to feel like a PhD in computer science just to get my job done. I don't want to be a capital E engineer. I don't know if this is true for you, but for me, the reason that I got into web development in the first place was I just wanted to build cool stuff for my friends. And I really loved the web because I could write just a little bit of code, save the file, and then instantly I got that feedback loop, and I saw something happening on the screen. A little bit of code gave me something really visual and fun and interactive, and I could share it with my friends, and they loved it as much as I did. And that experience was really important. And I want that feeling when I'm building things at work. So that to me is the sense that is captured by Octane, the thing that Octane brings. So like, let's imagine that we're trying to build this like little widget that shows the weather for a city that you put in based on the zip code, right? Now, the way that I would have done this in the past is I would just write up some HTML, some static HTML, right? And so we can do that with Octane. We can just create a component and just splat some static HTML in there, get it looking right with the CSS and the HTML, get the structure there.
And it's literally HTML. The HTML you write in the template is the same as the HTML in the browser.
So I'm starting with HTML like I did when I was a kid. And the next thing I want to do is I want to plug it into JavaScript, right? I want to have this be backed by some JavaScript data. Well, maybe I'd bring in jQuery in the past, but now I can just go and write the template, return that HTML into the template or the component that I would want to have, right? So I can just take these pieces where I've had some placeholder data and replace it with the dynamic double curlies to say, this is the city and this is the temperature from JavaScript. And now I can just add 2 lines of JavaScript, the track property. And again, I'm still using static data. It's a placeholder. But now I've just shifted it from HTML over into JavaScript. Now, unlike jQuery, I might want to go fetch this data from the API server now. I think I got these slides out of order in the last minute edit. I might want to go take this data from an API now. And making that a reusable thing in jQuery would have been a lot of effort, a lot of work. Like probably many of you got pretty far along with jQuery, and then all of a sudden it's like, now I want to have 2 of these, right? Better refactor all my code. So what's so nice about the system is before where we would have hit a cliff, we still have that simplicity, but now if we want to make it reusable, maybe we want to be able to specify the zip code by passing in an argument, for example. Now all we have to do is take that argument and use this.args to get the zip and change the string that we're using for the URL of the API that we hit, right? And then we just call this load weather method from our constructor, and we've built this thing that was very lightweight. It was very fun. It captured that feeling of what I loved about jQuery in the beginning, but I didn't hit this cliff where if I want to take this and turn it into something that I can actually go to production with or share with my team, we have a much more graceful path. So it's kind of, again, bending this curve of modern productivity with that feeling of lightweight, that lightweight feeling of writing HTML that we had before. And I think perhaps like the coolest thing now, having gone through building an Octane app a few times, is the fact that I don't lose anything through this process, right? I start, and I think in terms of HTML, I start there with my prototype. The template that I write looks so close to that HTML that I had in my head at the beginning. And then when I'm debugging or I'm looking through the developer tools to see the output, all 3 of these things look the same, right? They share the same bones. You can see the common thread.
This is like really the output in Glimmer. Like if you're used to the normal Ember output, this is really the output.
So what I love about Octane is it just feels really good to have a tool that you pick it up. And it's, it's something that sparks joy. I think that's something that's kind of been missing in front-end engineering for the past few years. In fact, when Yehuda and I were discussing Octane yesterday, like what is it about Octane that feels so special? There's one word that kept coming up over and over again in our conversation. That's fun.
Yeah. So yesterday I was spending a little bit too much time building a Magic the Gathering card search app with Octane when I should have been working on the Keynote.
That's true.
And the reason that happened is that it was actually pretty fun. Like the stuff we showed on the previous slides took away a lot of the drudgery. And I like Ember. I use Ember a lot on side projects, and I have fun doing it in some sense. But but there's so many details like this.get, like having your DSL in your class, like not being allowed to use classes that like really started to over time take some of the joy out of it. And we spend as an ecosystem so much time talking about like performance and correctness and build pipelines, and like that stuff is important. I'm glad we spent time on it. But like I love that we spent the last year like trying to bring back what is fun about web development and like what feels freeing about it, and like maybe putting on the shelf a little bit some of the biggie engineering stuff. Like we spent a few years on that, and like spending some time on making Ember fun has been itself a fun project.
Meta. So I'm excited to announce that you can try the Ember Octane preview today. Yehuda begged me, he said, please don't do the Steve Jobs thing.
Well, the reason is that we are not like coming down from the mountain from our corporate headquarters and like giving you Octane like many people in this room helped. So it doesn't feel like the right messaging, but if you joke about it, it's probably okay.
So many of the features basically all the features that we've talked about today have actually been in Ember for a while, many of them behind the feature flag. So thank you for everyone who has been trying these out, who's used them in their apps, who's given their feedback, and especially to people who have evaluated what teaching Octane is like. So many people spend a lot of time taking these ideas and presenting them to people who have never used Ember before and providing really great feedback that has strongly shaped, that real-world feedback has really shaped the evolution of these APIs and the level of polish. The whole community has been working really hard to refresh the documentation, to bring it up to date, to reflect the new Octane programming model, which is a really dramatic simplification of what we had before. And a preview of that updated documentation is available now. Just visit this URL, and we've got links out to everything. And we also have a blueprint that you can use to spin up a new Ember Octane application really quickly.
That's what I was using yesterday in my Magic the Gathering.
Yeah, well, maybe we shouldn't have published it until tomorrow, maybe.
Yeah, maybe. So that's Octane. We're really excited about it. We hope it makes your job more fun. And not only does Octane feel super modern, I think we found a way to do it in a way that brings everyone in the Ember community along with us, with things like code mods and a great interop story, like the track properties thing. And so during the preview period, over the next few months, we're going to be fine-tuning the documentation. We're going to be smoothing out any rough edges. We'll be improving error messages. And we need the whole community to update add-ons and documentation so things feel idiomatic together. Now, that's what Octane is about. There may be some things that you're excited about that didn't make it into Octane, but don't worry. Because we work iteratively, you don't need to wait another year before we start getting new features. Not everything we're working on right now got into Octane. It's by design, and we're going to keep landing things incrementally. So a few examples of the things that we're continuing to work on, that we're like literally working on now, is the new file layout for Ember, ability to use JavaScript imports in templates, and a new build system called Embroider.
So I guess we forgot to put your Magic the Gathering app on here. So while we want to keep today's focus on what we're shipping in Octane today, I do want to give you a small peek at Embroider. So Embroider is a next-generation build pipeline for Ember applications. One of the big motivators is just making it simpler and a lot faster, and also giving us the ability to unlock the kinds of asset optimizations that it's difficult for us to do today in the current architecture. And the whole thing is built on top of JavaScript modules. That's like the foundation upon which everything is based. So just to give you kind of like a high-level idea of how the architecture of Embroider works, this is a multi-stage build pipeline. So we start off by taking in your source files in however you prefer to author them. So for example, maybe you're writing vanilla JavaScript, but for many people, you're using something like TypeScript. Or maybe you're using JavaScript, but with a few like more experimental Babel plugins, for example. And maybe your CSS, maybe you're writing vanilla CSS, but maybe you're using something like Sass. So we take all of those and we compile them all down into what I'll call here the lingua franca layer, right? We compile everything down from your weird stuff to something that is like more standard, right? So in this case, whatever the latest version of JavaScript is, like ES.
D-hipster.
Yeah, whatever your hipster thing is, we're going to compile that into the corporate version. So like standard JavaScript, ES 2018, we'll compile it into our handlebars language, and we'll compile it into vanilla CSS. And then we take those files into now a standard format. We bundle them all together, which is both your application code, your application source, as well as your add-ons. We kind of pull them all together into one big file system tree of standard JavaScript modules that you could also just run in the browser if you have a browser that supports modules natively. And then the last step—
And you're willing for it to be very slow.
Yes, you would not want to do that in production, certainly. So the next step, for this reason, is a packager step, where we take that bundle, that tree of JavaScript modules, and we pass it into a packager step that puts it all together and builds these assets in an optimized way that you can put on the CDN and users can use in their browser. Now, I want to show you something. So this is Ember Observer, which you may be familiar with. It's kind of this guide, this website that helps you navigate the world of Ember add-ons. So this is Ember Observer running in production. Nothing really looks unusual here, but let's open up the developer tools and take a look at the JavaScript.
Pixels.
Yes, let's enhance. Enhance pixels. Enhance pixels again. What? Dun, dun, dun. So because we compile everything down to standard formats like HTML, CSS, JavaScript modules, we can feed these into popular ecosystem packagers.
That may not have been obvious, but that was a real thing. That was not a mock-up screenshot.
Yes, that is running. You can visit that today, beta.emberobserver.com. This is a Ember app built with, in this case, Webpack, running in production, exactly the same as before. Test Suite runs also using Webpack. So Embroider isn't, it's very far along. It wasn't ready for Octane, but like Yehuda said, doesn't matter. We're going to keep shipping incrementally. This is how the train model works. So it's real enough that apps like Ember Observer can be built. We can run their test suite. And we don't have to there's nothing to change in the app. I think that's an important thing to mention. These apps are vanilla. If you can go look at the pull request that Ed Faulkner wrote, the only change is to a small configuration change.
If you've been around for a while, it's kind of like the same philosophy as Glimmer 2 was, which is like you didn't have to do anything, and it just gave you better performance.
So we've made really amazing progress here. To take this mainstream, we need more people to try it. We need people to report issues and contribute. So we harness the power of the community like we always do. So we can figure out what the edge cases are lurking, and we'll need your help to make sure that we're auditing add-ons and making sure everything is compatible with this new, more modern build system.
So those are the things that are already in the pipeline. It's the things people are actively already working on. But of course, there are many other things that people want to work on. And the way that we figure out what to work on is the roadmap process, which we did last year. Soon, in about a month, what we're going to do is we're going to start the roadmap process for next year. And obviously, if you want us to keep working on the stuff people are already working on, that's like a good thing to say in the roadmap process. I'm going to definitely be putting in my vote for Embroider. But if there's other stuff you want to work on, that's a good time to talk about it and get everyone on the same page about what to prioritize. So finally, Octane is the work of a massive amount of people. And I want to give everyone in the audience a chance to recognize everyone for their amazing work. So I'm going to welcome everyone on the core team onto the stage. And this is not the entire core team. This is just everyone who could make it today.
Good job. So. Guys.
So there were some changes to the core team this year. There were some new members. Robert, as always, gained additional responsibilities. And there were some alumni, and I don't have any sad music to play, but you can imagine in the biopic. Chris Garrett is new to the Framework core team, which is great. So here's a bunch of features that didn't make it, and I want to talk a little bit about.
Didn't make it into the keynote. We should clarify. Didn't make it into the world.
Yes. The keynote is already too long, so we could not cover everything. But I want to talk a little bit about each project. So one of the things that we did this year is we created a new team, a new core team to manage the project itself called the steering committee. So anyone on the steering committee, can you step forward? And like anyone in the audience who helped with any of the work of the steering committee, stand up or make yourself known. Steering committee is a weird case, not so many people in the audience probably. But the steering committee did things like help us migrate to Discord, formalize the roadmap process, and manage the Octane edition. So if everyone can give them a round of applause. So thank you for the steering committee. The Framework core team, of course, is the team that focused on actually landing the features to support the edition. So step forward. And
well done, team.
We covered a lot of the banner features of the Framework team in the keynote, but the scope of the work this year covered a lot more, from stuff like new route helpers to the hard work of deprecating features and bringing people along, to little features like the array helper. It's been a great year. Anybody who worked on anything in the framework, can you either stand up or make yourself known?
Woo!
And I guess no one's playing along.
That's like if you file issues, pull requests.
I know for a fact there's people in the audience.
They're just very humble.
It's true. So that's the framework team, but the hard work of the framework team only comes together when the learning team incorporates the features into the documentation, because learning is the lifeblood of any framework. So anyone on the learning team, step forward. Great. And not only did the learning team support the Octane edition, they overhauled the Ember CLI documentation, they upgraded all the public website infrastructure, released 51 editions of the Ember Times, and migrated ember.js.com to an Ember app, which is pretty amazing. So give them a round of applause. Ember CLI is the workhorse of Ember. It quietly supports all of our big initiatives. It's the way that we manage to actually make progress without leaving people behind. So everyone step forward. On top of supporting the Octane edition, which every team did, the Ember CLI team implemented parallel compilation, updated Ember to use Broccoli 2, which means no more temp files in your directories. Big deal for me. Yeah, exactly. Gets its own round of applause. And it created Ember optional features and in general did an amazing work on tons of migration code mods. So thank you, everyone. Give them a round of applause. And finally, on top of supporting the edition, the Ember data team has been quietly plugging away to improve the architecture of Ember's official data solution. So anyone on the Ember data team, step forward. And as I said earlier, the Ember data team pulled off the hardest part of eliminating jQuery from the default stack, because jQuery.ajax turns out to be a very big API. They also created new low-level primitives like record data and improved workflow tooling with async leak detection and generally better support for fast boot rehydration mode. This is all quiet work, but it's important. So everybody give them a round of applause. And finally, I want to thank Melanie Sumner for tireless work on accessibility. She does amazing work both on making Ember better on this front, but also in educating the core team on what is required and evangelizing the requirements to the wider community. So thank you very much, and everyone give her a round of applause. Yeah.
And Sumner. No.
All right, for some definition of on time, we're on time.
Nope.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
We have a great show for you today. We hope you enjoy it. We hope you are welcoming and inviting people who are new in. So we'll be back here in
10 minutes.
10 minutes. If you go outside, we've got some coffee. You can get some refreshments and drinks, and we'll see you back here in 10 minutes. Thank you all very much.
Have fun with Octane.